My name is Nate Weisenberg. I'm doing this interview for the Atomic Heritage Foundation with Kathleen Maxwell here in Wellesley, Massachusetts. It's Monday, April 25th, 2016. Or how did you get involved with the Manhattan Project?
Had just finished my master's degree at Smith, and I was contemplating staying at Smith because the main men in our department there had gone to work for the Manhattan Project someplace else. And our son used to go to college in the Midwest, and one of his professors knew that his mother worked in physics at Smith, so he contacted me and asked me if I would be interested in, or what I was going to do. And I told him I didn't really know. I would probably stay teaching at Smith because they were kind of light in the department at that time. But I was not intending to be a teacher all my life. So I said, sure, I might be interested in that. And so he passed the word on to Kelleck's people who were looking for a physicist or a scientist, either a chemist or a physicist, for exactly the sort of job that I signed up for. And my red blood count was not quite proper. It wasn't high enough. So they said, you've got to get that blood number up before we can let you work in the lab, because there's so much radiation around that lab all the time. It was a very important point that they always checked up on, and they kept checking you regularly. So by the time I got that, I got it and started. This actually was one of the first things, the business of the oil leaking through these gaskets. They didn't know how to attack that. And when we discovered through reading the literature behind it that there was a reaction between the activity or the electronic activity during a lightning storm, and that a lot of these same changes were things that happened in the lab, and they caused the same thing that lightning you smell it in the air, and that's what happened to the gaskets. They were being invaded by particles that are not normally there. So you don't think of them as being something that would come in and give you problems. And that's when I told them if I looked at it in a microscope, I might be able to know more about what is actually happening to the holes in the gaskets. And they chased that down in the gasket department. You never had to worry about it. Once you figured out what the problem was, they just shoved it on to the people that had caused it, or that should have found it in the first place.
And for people who might not know about this, so who did you work for during the project, and where did you work?
I worked at the Kelleck's compound in Jersey City, New Jersey, and I lived in Jersey City at the time. I found an apartment there, and Francis had gone with the Army by then, and I didn't see him until after the war. That was in 1942, about, must have been April, May then, because right after graduation, I made the change.
So right after you graduated from Smith, you went to work for Kellex?
For Kellex.
And Francis is your husband. When and how did you meet him?
In physics department in University of North Dakota, where we both were seniors. And I was department graduate, well, not graduate, but undergraduate help in the physics department. I got the fun of taking the exhibits out and being sure everything worked, and reading kind of helping the mostly boys do the experiments, and then I read their notebooks of their write-ups. So it was the Department of Physics that got me going. I originally thought I would be in mathematics because that was my best subject. But I got a scholarship for 2 years at Smith to work part-time in the department and get my degree, my master's degree. So it was after that that I started for them. It was probably April, May, something like that, by the time I actually got started.
Were you interested in math and science from when you were very young?
I guess I've always been. I had an excellent teacher in high school. Yeah, I even had a good one in Catholic high school in junior and senior years. Those gals weren't very good at teaching it, but I had such a good base in arithmetic and algebra that I went right into the full engineering math at college.
And you went to the University of North Dakota?
Yeah, and I took all their mathematics degrees all the way through, and I studied chemistry and physics there too. So, but because I had no financial backing whatsoever, I had to earn money somehow, so I got, my sister knew the registrar and introduced me to him. He gave me found I was good at arithmetic, so he gave me a job in the registrar's office at the university, and I worked for them all 4 years, and as well as the book department and anything else. The reproduction, they didn't have any automatic reproduction of records, so, and I worked in the summertime there. While I was at Smith, I'd come back, and I had to make copies of all the records that had any changes in them. In the summertime, we didn't have a dark room good enough for that kind of work. So I had to wait till dark before I went to work in the summertime, and I would work till I got that day's work done every night, all summer, and I made enough money to buy some clothes for Smith the next year.
Where did you grow up?
In Grand Forks, North Dakota.
So that's where you were born?
and that's where the university is, which is why I was able to go to college.
Do you mind telling me what day the day and year you were born?
July 23rd, 1918, which was a little before the end of the war, and the beginning of a terribly hard season for all those farmers out there. It was the beginning of the terrible depression, and nobody had any money. My dad was an insurance salesman, and he was an excellent businessman, but no farmers had the money to put any insurance money out. They were lucky if they had enough to get their crop planted each year. So our family, by then, had 5 children, and my mother was an excellent cook. The rest of the women in town would hire her to do the big dinners for them because she was so good and everybody knew it. So she was approached about putting out the dinners for the farmers would all come in on Saturday, even if they didn't have any money to buy much. And the dinner at the dime store was where she was working. They were loaded, and they loved it as long as she worked there. And she was able to finance the family then, but she was injured falling from a stepladder of some sort and had to quit work. And then, by then, all of us I was in college, and I was kind of saved by this scholarship that I had earned, and it took care of me, and I was the youngest. The rest were all old enough to get jobs of some sort, and everybody pitched in and did what we could do to survive.
So how did you decide to move to Smith for graduate school? You got the scholarship and you decided you would move to Massachusetts?
Smith has a Mountain Day celebration when all the trees are most beautiful. And the first Mountain Day, the graduate kids one of the girls gave me a ride up to her camp in Maine, or no, New Hampshire, and we climbed the mountains there. And I said, I don't ever want to live anyplace else. My husband's work took us all over the country before the war, and we had to find a place to live every month or two. When the jobs were finished, you had to go to another town and find another room with kitchen privileges because we couldn't afford hotels. And that was a pretty pathetic existence. So the Army was just a continuation of that sort of thing.
When did you get married?
And the 25th of March in 1942.
Was he in the Army when you got married?
No, he was due in the next week.
So he was drafted right afterwards.
Yeah. Well, he had Army experience in college. They had a very complete service for for men that would join and he was a retired, he was an officer right away because of his training at the University of North Dakota. So he was an our officer, and he was a training officer down in the Panama Canal Zone while I was at Kellex all that time.
Do you remember when you moved to New Jersey to work for Kellex?
It would have been late in 42 spring, late spring.
And so you'd heard through a friend, is that right, that they were looking for people to work there?
Yeah. Well, it was the men in our department at Smith were already not drafted, but they were requested to consult the physics people in Washington as to where they should be applying for work, where the jobs, what people were needed. Of course, they didn't tell you what we were working on, but nobody had any doubts about what it was. We knew from our physics, keeping up to date with what was going on in physics, there's no question about what you knew we were going to be working on. It just be some part of it. And it was amazing when we found, when I found that every job that was suggested that I asked if they needed me was connected with the same stuff.
So they didn't tell you exactly what it was, but you knew you'd be working. You knew you were working on the bomb in some way.
In that area. Now, one of the girls that was in physics at Smith when I think she left before I did, and she worked in the California section of one of the mountains out there, and I think she was working on electronics, which I came in to, I used some of them in my master's degree, but I was not, it was not my field. My field was, I loved to fool around in the department at Smith in the shop, learn how to use tools, and I had to do some pretty careful machining to get my work project so that it would do what I wanted to do, which was to make one like they had made at MIT for the one of their departments in measuring high voltage. So I had to figure out how to measure the high voltage on a high voltage machine, because that's what we were in the process of constructing at Smith before I left.
And could you just sort of generally describe for me, when you got to Kellex in New Jersey, what you were working on?
I think the first was the leaking gaskets, and none of us had any experience with that because that was put out by the chemical men who devised that gasket material. They spent their life doing that. That was their biggest project, was making tight gaskets, and then they were disgusted because they kept leaking. And we had to try to find out why. Well, we can tell you about the beginning of that problem.
Sure.
They found that they spent a lot of time and money developing the kind of gaskets that they put in, because, of course, with the violent subject that they're using, it's hard on normal surfaces. And they had a lot of trouble making those surfaces stay clean. So they want to know what I might think about doing with that. So I looked at some of the thing. I'm not a person who uses these very often, but we did. I did look at it, and I could see that there were leak holes. And we finally decided that what was causing them was the atmosphere. There was the same atmosphere that you can smell when there's lightning around you. You can smell it. And that's what was doing the trouble, the problem. There were just too many sources of that were messing up the gasket surface so that it leaked. And then that was the start. Of course, once you get a leak in something like that, it gets bigger. So they found out that that was something they had to do about those gaskets. And I didn't have anything to do with what they did. We just tell them what was going on, and that was up to the people that made the gaskets to go and do something.
So just to...
So they did something because they continued to use them. And then we had a lot of problems with the actual leakage of the pressurized material after it goes through the gasket in the procedure down in the site. They had a lot of leakage. It dripped through the barriers and through screenings. We tried to mop it up before it dripped, and it didn't hold very well. And we had a lot of problems with those little barriers that we put up. So I looked at what was inside these little packages that were made a barrier and decided there are a lot of things that could be in there that could be doing this, that the material didn't get absorbed enough, it just let it through. And if it's if it's too solid, it wouldn't let it through. But we had to get something that would stay the same in spite of acid fluid going through it. So I went to the people that were manufacturing these cleaning wires that are put in together in a package, and you buy them to clean pots and pans when they're really messed up. And I told them that we weren't very happy about the size of the wire that they were making them out of, and that we thought it would be a lot better if we had a choice of different measures of wire. So they said, well, we can just make you up a set of all the possibilities and try them out, which we did, and found out that they were using much too big a diameter wire. So he made up special ones for us, and we substituted those, and they worked much better, which was fun. Going into their company and showing how they made these things.
So just we
And
can.
so that was one topic we had a good reaction to. Then they're still getting so much oil over that we thought there was something violently wrong still. So the boys came from, our men would go down there and find out what was giving them trouble, bring back the trouble, and we would have a convocation and decide who should mess with it. It seemed to be in somebody's territory, and that seemed to be something that we could help them with. So we designed an area of the laboratory there that about half the size of this room, and tried to heat it up as much as we could, because we had to be 140 degrees in order for anything to work down at the site. And I said I thought we could do that. So we decided to remake their idea of what those pressures were at the various lines along pressure input. And in doing so, we discovered that they had a section of this curvature. The pressure apparently was not working right. They didn't have a good take on what the pressure was. And we discovered that they were not using an ordinary pressure device, a column of mercury, and just changing the readings by changing that. And we put that in and used it all the way along, and discovered that their answers in that, they were using a device to tell them what the pressure was, and a device up here. And in between, they didn't say how they did it. So when we substituted the proper values in there, we got, instead of a smooth curve, which everything else is a nice smooth curve, it was popping up 3 or 4 times as high as before. So they had missed that completely because they didn't do their pressure increases consistently all the way through. And we found that by going back to our value of what they should be looking for a minimum amount of carry-through of liquid, we found that they wouldn't have anywhere near as much trouble. And so they inserted that, and they changed that right away.
Did you know what the gaskets were for? What they were going to be used for?
Everything that you put together actually, Kellex was a chemical factory to start with of some sort.
Well, this might be a good thing to talk about. So Kellex was run by a company called was formed from a company called the Kellogg Company.
And they were they put out chemical products. I never found out what.
But this wasn't the same Kellogg as the cereal company. This is a different Kellogg Company.
Yes, it was Kellogg Company, and this is Kellex that I worked for.
when you wrote to your husband during the war when he was in Panama, you couldn't tell him what you were working on, right?
That's right. He had no idea. My mother thought we were working for a cornflake company.
And you were working on designing material that was going to go into one of the plants at Oak Ridge in Tennessee. Is that right?
Yeah.
Do you remember which plant that was?
Uh,
Do you remember if it was the what they called the K-25 plant at Oak Ridge?
no, I don't know anything about that. It was not used as, it was just at the site.
It was all just at the site at Jersey City.
Yeah.
Did anyone ever explain why you were working on this, or was it all sort of keep your head down and just do what you're told?
It's neither. We knew what we were working on. We knew how important it was. And there was no question about what came first.
Did you and did other people think that what you were working on could help end the war?
Oh yes, we all helped. We knew that a lot more than the war was dependent on what happened, because we were, all of us knew what was happening in the north of Germany, and what they were looking for in Norway. And
so you knew the Germans were interested in building something like this too, and they had that heavy water plant in Norway.
We knew a lot of our changes, of our things, depended on the timing, that whether we got it before Germany did, because we knew Germany was trying hard.
So with you and everyone you worked with, there was a real sense of urgency to get the job done.
And extreme. If you started working on something, you worked until it was finished. You might 4:30 didn't mean anything, or 5 o'clock. You'd work till you were tired, or you had to hit a point of stopping and then start the next day. But you stuck with what you were working on, and you didn't. You worked weekends. Weekends didn't mean a thing. You worked at whatever you were doing that seemed to be where you knew what you had to do next.
Could you describe for me what the laboratory, what the plant was like? Was it a very big place where a lot of people were working, or was it a pretty small environment you were working in?
It was small environments, but we all worked for Dr. Johnson.
What was his first name? Do you remember?
I don't know. We just called him Dr. Johnson.
And he worked for Kellex as well.
Yes, he was. He had a bad leg, so he had a very limpy walk, and he was a very intelligent and sensible man. And then he had all the various types of material that people would be working from. He'd have a group for each one, a group leader, and at least one or two trained people that worked under this group leader. And then each group would get a batch of draftees to do the hard work of putting these things through the tests that had to be done so that we could know that they were good enough to do this, or throw away ones that didn't measure up. And then there were, these people kept track of, and the trained people would be sure that they had the training records of all these things recorded properly, and that the soldiers were doing what they had to do. They weren't just going to sleep and putting a few figures down, right? And then the trained people would look at the records and try and analyze how whether accomplishing what they had to accomplish was what to be able to turn a certain volume of material over to the site so they could run them through the machines.
So you were telling me that one of your responsibilities was trying to fix the problem with the gaskets that kept leaking.
Well, that was general. When the problems at the site would come up, our men would go down and figure out what they could figure, and what they couldn't figure, they would come back and tell us exactly what the problems were, and it was up to us to figure out how to get around it somehow, so that we could continue with what our job was, which was to we'd run the barriers through a certain very definite array of tests, and that was to acclimate the holes in the barriers so that they won't, a fresh one would change from the beginning to what was good enough to work in the corporation. And that was the reason that our men had to cycle these things through, so they got a certain amount of protection. As anything, when it starts getting protected, is going to change. And once you get it changed, it's have to stay that way for quite a while. So that was what we had to turn over to the site to use.
And I know building the barrier and finding good barrier materials is one of the big challenges that they had to overcome.
That was a department. It's completely separate. Mm-hmm. I have no idea who did that.
So you were working on something else then?
We were acclimating the barriers so they wouldn't suddenly get very much smaller, maybe. It was what we were afraid of, I think. To keep it big enough to start with so that it would end up being the right size. That was the project.
And this was all part of the process for enriching enough uranium, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
So you were working on filters and some of the filters and the tubing as well, is that right?
Well, the barriers were in the tubing, so the product would come along with two different atomic weights, and then the tubing or the barrier would separate them, so they go off in different directions.
And so you were helping to test some of the equipment that went into that, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. Were there other things you were involved on when you were working for Kellex, or was that sort of your primary responsibility? Were you involved in other projects too for Kellex, or were you working primarily on the barriers?
Oh, everything was everything was the way the site was operating. If it was going smoothly, then we just worked on the barriers. If it wasn't going smoothly, we had to figure out what was the trouble and to correct it. So that was the main reason for our division, was those critical things that happened that weren't supposed to happen. Now, why did it happen? That was up to us to figure out and correct it.
So you were troubleshooting in
A
a way.
troubleshooter, exactly.
Do you remember some of those other problems that you had to troubleshoot or had to solve?
Well, I didn't know if there were various chemical problems that I didn't have to mess with because I wasn't a chemist. I was a physicist more. So it was physical things. But there was always the question of how do we keep the oil that has gone over into the product, into where it should be separated, but it's got too much oil in it. What happens to that if it, because everything drains down to downhill, and when it gets downhill it puddles, and it's too concentrated to go near. A person has to have very special equipment to go and handle a puddle, and you have to drain it first, and then you have to figure out why it's happening and try to stop it. And until you get it stopped, the plant is held up, or at least that particular line. And we were trying to keep everything going all the time.
Were you working with quite a number of other people? Were there lots of other people who were sort of on your team?
Well, in our department, Dr. Anderson, or Dr. Johnson was, of course, the head of the lab, and Dr. Johnson, or Dr. What's his name? Anderson.
Anderson.
Was a physical therapist, or physical chemist. So, he was excellent. He's an excellent man. He could even blow bubbles, glasses for testing. When we had this setup, we had to be able to decide how much was coming through. More than just looking, it was cloudy. There's a lot of oil in that. We couldn't let it go at that. He blew these globes about that side, and he could attach the glass blowing. He was an excellent glass blower. And he attached the entrance to these balls and the exit, and ran a beam through it. And the cloudier it was, or the more oil there was, the more beam there was, or the more oil there was in it. And so he calibrated these big glass globes that he could blow, and made, we did what we both decided would have been a good PhD project had we done it at college instead of doing it for the government. So you never got any fame from that. But we saw, it really was a problem that was a basic problem when we started. That was what was troubling everybody. But all these other things sort of added to it in various places. And we did our best to keep it going. And I think we did pretty well.
Was there a point when you knew that that everything was going to work and they were going to be able to produce the bomb before the end of the war?
Yes. That was about the time that Francis, my husband, got permission for me to go to Panama. And at that point, I could be relieved because it wasn't as serious as it had been. We knew they were on their way to do it.
So this would have been probably in 1945 sometime?
Yeah. In fact, Francis got leave taking to come home at the same time that I was going to go down there. So my luggage had to be turned around and held for me so that it wouldn't be down in Panama and me be up here. So at that time, yes, we all knew it was going to be all right.
Do you remember when you heard about the bombing of Hiroshima, and then you knew that it had worked, what you'd been working on?
Well, of course, everybody heard immediately. It was a terrific celebration. I had just left television, Kellex at the time that happened. I had, as a matter of fact, maybe a month before that, we had gone, they had sort of dissolved the lab, and I was with the groups that went to New York University.
Mm-hmm. So were you still working for the project at that point, or were you no longer?
At the point, yeah, but it was only a matter of a few weeks before the bomb was dropped.
So you got transferred to New York, and then essentially it was over.
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you remember when you stopped working for the project?
Mm-mm. It was probably a week before, maybe 2 weeks before the bomb was dropped.
Yeah. What was? Do you remember what your reaction and your colleagues' reaction was when you heard the news?
Well, I think all of us wondered, well, we've done it. We've saved one terrible thing. Have we done another?
Yeah. Have your thoughts about that sort of changed at all over the years? About working on the project?
I think that what would have happened to all the men who were in the service at that time, all of those men are a lot more than the one that got messed up with the atomic bomb.
And just thinking as well about working at Kellex, do you remember did if anyone important from the project ever came in and visited where you were working? Did somebody like Dobie Keith or General Groves ever come by?
General Groves sure did. Who else did you suggest?
Dobie Keith, Percival Keith, who was sort of the head of Kellex.
I don't know. I wouldn't have known.
Did you ever meet General Groves?
I think he went through our lab, but I didn't. He didn't strike me.
Do you remember what he looked like?
He looked like an army man.
People have a lot of stories about him. He was quite a character.
No, I don't. I never heard anything about him except that a few epithets.
Oh, so you knew he was involved in the project in some
Oh,
way. Yeah. Did you know he was the leader of the project, or did he just seem like an army officer who was visiting? Do you remember?
He had a big job. He must have done it pretty well because he succeeded.
Actually, one other question that comes to mind is: do you remember? Was there a lot of security around where you were working? Were there a lot of were there a lot of army? Were there a lot of people making sure that you didn't talk about what you were working on?
And that was a general idea. He never, because in general, those soldiers that were working on it had no idea what they were working on. But most of the physicists did. Now, physicists would, because they were following the general line of experimentation. So they were, it wasn't very much of a stretch for them to figure out what was going on. But say somebody in some other angle, physics and chemists were strongly involved. They all knew what was going on. But very seldom the rest of them, they just knew it was a big deal.
You knew it was a big deal, and it was also just sort of the general idea that you weren't supposed to talk about it, right?
No, you didn't, and in fact, they just called it the fluid, the X fluid.
The X fluid? Wow. Was that what they would call uranium, or was that just the stand-in for what you were working on?
The uranium, because that's an acid fluid. And they were very careful if you had a wound that you wore those tablets that recorded how much you have, and they did analysis of urine regularly.
Were they worried about radiation exposure?
Yeah, because all of that testing is done with the fluid.
So you and the other people you work with, they'd all be checking on your exposure periodically?
Yeah, periodically, yeah. And all of those, I think everybody in that lab had extra insurance policies.
Everyone working there?
Everybody working with it, yeah, because they were all exposed. If there was an explosion or something, they had to be insured. Which is one reason they would let me work right away, because I didn't follow the obligations. I was too low on my white count.
So maybe if you could just explain that. So they were, because of your blood cell count, they were a little concerned about exposing you to this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And that was some testing that you had to do at Smith before you could work on the project. Is that right?
They had me checked up by a doctor to start. and I had to get a check later, a week later maybe, and by then I had done all the things that they told me to do, and my count was all right.
Do you remember what they told you to do?
Eat more, I guess.
So it sounds like you were working very long hours, especially when they were running into
Yeah.
problems. Did you live sort of nearby in Jersey City?
I had an apartment in the kind of a garden right in the middle of Jersey City. So I could take a bus out that direction, and it would drop about a mile from the site, and I had to walk the last mile along the water. There's an inlet there someplace. So it was cold in the wintertime. I didn't know that any other science people were working there, women. The women were all more bookkeepers. And
The women were, I'm sorry?
the women in our divisions were all secretaries.
So you were the only
As
female
far as I
physicist
know, I
there?
was the only trained person, or girl.
Wow.
There weren't many people majoring in physics. Courses all along, it was always about 20 to 1 wherever I took courses.
Maybe 20 men for one woman.
Yeah, at the University of North Dakota.
How did it feel to be sort of the only female physicist where you were working?
I think it made me work harder. You need to be a dope.
Do you remember what you did during your time off when you weren't working on the project? When you had breaks, what you did?
Oh, one Easter, everybody, all my family was away, and one of the fellows suggested that he was going to go up to the New Jersey hills, or the New York hills actually, on his motorcycle, and he said, "You want to come along?" And I said, "Sure." So we went up there and dangled our feet. That's where the picture was taken, on our Easter Sunday in New York, in the mountains.
One other detail that I wanted to make sure to ask about is you were working on scrubbers for our uranium solution. Is that right?
You were in a kitchen and you had a pan that cleaned that had been burned, and you got a what do they call those?
Okay.
It's a clump. They're mounted on a board, and this would be enclosed in a board with a handle on it,
Okay.
and you scrub it. It's made of fine wire, and you scrub the dirt off or the burn off but in something with a little, it's enclosed in the outside edge, and the fluid can flow through it, through that wire stuff. And the finer the wire, the finer the absorption of, or the wire will absorb more fluid if it's real fine. If it's very coarse, it doesn't get very much of it. So that's why they gave me a run of all the various sizes of wire that they made them in, and I tried them all, and the finest ones worked best to keep the oil. It would somehow stop the oil from going through, where the heavy wire didn't seem to absorb it much. Of course, there's a lot more exposure in the fine wire, and it did the job. It'll get it drip so that lets it drip sooner, and your return oil drip is not so much, it doesn't have too much return.
Okay. So you were using, so the fine wire was helping you solve the problem with the oil.
Yeah. And of course we put some filters horizontally and some vertical, because you get different dripping times depending upon how the angle of drip.
Is there anything else about working on the project that you'd like to share with me? Or are there any stories that I haven't asked you about?
I've never been so absorbed in any one thing in my life as I was in that. It just had to be done.
What did you do? What did you do after you worked on the project?
What did I do? Francis went back to work for Pile Driving Company, and in short order I was tutoring in Wellesley at first, and we had a company, a business company that drove piles in for big buildings and for bridges and stuff like that. And we had how many years? From 45 to 80 about.
No,
And
the company will be 50 years old here in another couple of months.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow! Oh my goodness!
So,
And we sold it to Jim when Jim got old enough to decide he knew more about it than Francis did, which was true. And he made a big success of it. And Jim did. We just kind of kept our noses above water.
And you've been married for 74 years? Wow, that's a wonderful story.
And he's 99, so we assume that he will be 100 years old in this house.